All right. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Self-Improvement Friday, and my friend John is here to talk about Oscar Wilde and Dorian Gray. Take it away.
Thank you. So welcome back, everyone who is returning. Welcome for everybody who is new here. We discuss a new idea every single week on Friday that is pertaining to self-improvement. Mind you, I always try to pick a context for material. This is not a book review of Dorian Gray. I'm only using this for context to substantiate the idea of living a transparent life. So I'm going to go over, summarize the relevant and necessary points from the particular book. If you haven't read it, that's totally fine. And then we're going to dive into the implication and how we can apply these ideas to live a more improved life. So, picture of Dorian Gray. It follows the protagonist, which is this young man, and he's very susceptible, and he places significant value on his physical appearance. So he's very handsome, and people tell him this, and he ends up meeting this particular painter, and this painter wants to, capture his beauty in some way. He's enthralled by it, and he says, I need to capture this. I'm fascinated by it. And hence the title, Picture of Dorian Gray, of course. So he subsides, he lets him do this. And then there's another figure that ends up influencing Dorian in, I would argue, a detrimental way. Even though seemingly innocuous, it ends up being very malicious how it manifests itself. This other individual, I think Lord Henry, if I'm not mistaken, I read it a while ago. The characters aren't that important, but there's another figure that influences Dorian Gray, and he points out his beauty to him. And he kind of points out the ephemeral and ethereal nature of youth and beauty in and of itself. He says, okay, yes, you're beautiful. You are very handsome. You're a very attractive young man. You're very charismatic, but that is all transitory. That is not going to last. That is you would say, a depreciating asset, right? You have to actually develop your character. You're not just going to attract people and live a fulfilled life because you are aesthetically desirable, right? So this kind of plants a seed of panic in the young impressionable Dorian. And once he sees Basil, which is the artist, once he sees his portrait that he captured, he's also enthralled and fascinated by this portrait in and of itself. So he's rather vain and narcissistic in a way. And what he does in the particular moment when he sees this portrait, he's fascinated by it. So he kind of wishes, he says, I wish I would trade my soul if I could never age, if I would look like this for eternity, for the rest of my life. And the portrait instead would exhibit signs of age and wear and decay, right? And mortality. So that's what he ends up doing. And for whatever reason, it works. And he stays, as his appearance of, I don't know how old he was, let's say 20-year-old self forever. And the painting is going to represent the mortality, right? So you're going to see physical signs of aging in the painting. So he got what he wanted, right? So he goes on and he kind of implements his hedonistic and narcissistic ideals in the world, only thinking about himself. And he ends up doing a little bit of, I would say, detrimental and malicious deeds toward other people. In particular, he falls in love with this girl. She's an actor. Things fall apart because it's kind of a trivial reason, but it's not really relevant to the plot. But they fall apart, and she ends up becoming heartbroken because he calls off their commitment, their wedding, whatever it happens to be. She ends up committing suicide because of this. So he seemed very distant with the whole thing. He was very just like, oh, whatever, it's not my fault type of thing. Although he was at fault, he was somewhat at least at responsibility. And then this is the first, indication that he sees aging in his painting. He goes home and he sees the painting, and there's some look of contempt or malice, you would say, represented in the painting. Because remember, all signs of aging and mortality are going to be exhibited in the painting and not his physical appearance. So he sees it there, and he's like, okay, that's interesting. He continues to live this very selfish, narcissistic, hedonistic lifestyle, kind of tarnishing his reputation year after year after year. And then people just kind of get a sense of his aura. They kind of pick up on that energy, and he's not really an attractive or desirable person to be around. And he's kind of people kind of shun away from him at social events. And this painting is getting more and more weathered, more and more decrepit, more aged. And he eventually just hides it because he can't deal with it anymore. Fast forward about 18 years later, Basil, the individual who painted the portrait in the first place, comes to see Dorian. And Dorian is kind of contemptuous at this whole situation, and he tries to blame his entire situation on Basil, on the painter. And he says, look at what you did. And he shows him the painting, and it's this horrible, decrepit old man with a very malevolent look in his eyes. And Basil's like panicking. He's like, what did you do? What is going on here? Like, is this your true character? And then I guess in a fit of rage, Dorian actually kills the painter. So obviously that further exemplifies like malice on the portrait itself. And then he like ends up, helping or asking someone for help to hide the body and trying to cover up all of his tracks and doing all of these other malicious ideals and actions. And the story ends with Dorian being so disgusted by this painting when he looks at it. There's such a discrepancy between his youthful glow and like this decrepit painting. He ends up taking the knife, stabbing the painting, but in some weird twist of fate, he ends up killing himself in the process. So somebody walks in and what they see is like this decrepit old man. So it was quickly reverted in that moment of death back to his physical, tangible being. And the painting is immaculate, just as it was in the first place of 20-year-old Dorian. So that's like a twist of fate at the end. So really interesting, very thought-provoking story. A lot of themes we can extract from it. And I chose to extract the theme that we're going to focus on here of, I guess, living a transparent life, right? Living authentically, not fabricating an appearance, not wearing a mask, not contriving an identity for other people to adhere to or try to influence people in a subversive way. So to look into the theme, I'm going to start off with a quote from the book. This is actually from Basil at the time toward the end of the book when he sees the portrait of Dorian Gray in its old decrepit state. And he says, "Sin is a thing that writes itself across a man's face. It cannot be concealed. People talk sometimes of secret vices. There are no such things. If a wretched man has a vice, it shows itself on the lines of his mouth, the droop of his eyelids, the molding of his hands even." So he's kind of exhibiting that. And he had an idea, even though obviously this was an exception that Dorian had his youthful glow, he had a sense something was wrong because of the, ramifications and consequences that Basil saw in other people. He knew something was up with Dorian's character, right? His morality was tainted, you can say. So you can't really, it makes me think of that phrase, what you do speaks so loud, I can't hear what you say, right? So you can, words are kind of, in a sense, hollow. You can contrive an identity. You can persuade people if you're charismatic, especially in Dorian's case. He's young and attractive. He's very charismatic. He can have influence. He can have persuasion over people and like contrive this identity and say, hey, I'm this way. I want to be part of your guys' social group. I want to be part of this. But again, your actions, they speak so loud. A lot of people can see right through that fabrication and speak. It's very, very superficial. So there's another quote that made me I thought of when I was rereading this for this discussion. And it's actually from Walden, from Thoreau. And what Walden was doing, I'm not going to go into a whole analysis of that, but he drew a parallel between, he had a lot of like rumination on particular events in nature because he had 2 years to spend in the woods by himself. And he was ruminating particularly on a pond, okay? Walden Pond in particular, in I think it's like Concord, Massachusetts. Anyways, and he draws a parallel to the ethics of men. So this next paragraph is from Walden, and we're going to go into a little bit of analysis here. So he says, "What I have observed in the pond is no less true in ethics. It is the law of average. Such a rule of the two diameters not only guides us toward the sun and the system and the heart of man, but draw lines through the length and breadth of the aggregate of a man's particular daily behaviors and waves of life into his coves and inlets, and where they intersect will be the height and depth of his character." So a little bit poetic and flowery, I guess you can say, but he's talking essentially of the depth of a pond, right? So he's saying like, okay, it seems deep, and that's the only reason why we're going to assume it's deep. We haven't actually inquired to its character. And he's drawing a analogy to people. He's saying if they appear deep, that might not always be an indication of actual depth or intellectual value. He's saying really don't buy appearances, and there's always something deeper than the surface. So this also, I mean, the particular word, the particular phrase of a pond, this made me think of a different quote by Nietzsche, where he says something very, very profound. Nietzsche, this is in the Gay Science, where he says, "Those who know they are profound strive for clarity. Those who would like to seem profound strive for obscurity." So he says something similar, that they muddy the water to make it seem deep, right? And he says, "For the crowd believes that if it cannot see the bottom of something, it must be profound. The crowd is so timid and dislikes going into the water. So they don't really spend the time to actually inquire about people's behavior or people's morals or people's ethics. They take exactly what is exhibited at first glance as superficial behavior for reality. And I think that's at a lot of people's detriment, because there could be malicious people obviously Dorian Gray being a prime example of this. He was betraying people left and right, but he had this, this youthful glow, this charismatic appearance that let people really not take that malicious or malevolent ideals seriously. So it was kind of just like under the radar. It was kind of like swept aside. So I would say that's very important for us to question narratives, question intentions, and work deductively. Obviously, you can't really make complete blanket assumptions about people from their intentions. But actions words are very, you can say superficial, they're hollow. They are exemplifying what somebody wants the world to think about them, right? And actions prove who you are. Words only prove, I would say, who you want to be, if that makes sense. So actions prove who you are. Actions are, this is a belief, this is an idea from Jordan Peterson. He's saying, he explains actions are, you act on what you believe to be true. So those are your beliefs. You act as if they are true in the world. You don't just espouse these things intellectually or superficially in order to get social merit, in order to get validation, or in order to get acceptance in a particular social group, or whatever your motive happens to be. So there's also an idea. It's like in terms of Dorian Gray, he was completely lying to himself this entire time. He wanted to be, he had this subvertive motive, and I guess ulterior motives on other people. He was lying to himself because there was sort of some sort of like repression or blockage, I would say. And there's a Dostoevsky, there's an idea from Dostoevsky which makes me I think it was perfectly pertinent to this particular idea here. Dostoevsky says, above all, do not lie to yourself. The man who lies to himself and listens to his own lie comes to a point where he cannot distinguish the truth within him or around him, and so loses respect for himself and others. And having no respect, he ceases to love. So this would be the exemplification of Dorian being completely heartless to this young girl in particular that he fell in love with, completely betrayed her, and then he would like mindlessly and without a conscience just kill somebody who he had a connection with for 2 decades. Just snap judgment, had no idea. And I think that was a result of him living this lie, you would say, buying his own lie. He lied to himself for so many years that he began to buy it. So I think it's like, I think that the extraction from that is you can't necessarily hide everything from people. If you're trying to contrive an identity, it's going to be illuminated in one of 2 ways. It's going to be called out by other people in terms of, in Dorian cases, at the end of the story, there was a lot of people that he had a bad reputation for a lot of people, and they didn't particularly know why. They just didn't like being around him. They didn't want to associate with him. He was exiled from a lot of circles. So that would be one instance of your, you could say, false character being illuminated. The second would be, I would say, this Dostoevsky quote. So it's saying like your guilty conscience would arise from living that lie, and you would have this like discordance with yourself. You would have this repressed idea. I mean, psychoanalysis 101, whatever is impressed must be expressed, right? You can't fully bury a thought for a while. It's going to come back magnitudes more malicious and malevolent than if you dealt with it in the first place. So it makes me think of the idea from Carl Jung. He says, until you make the unconscious conscience, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So Dorian was trying to repress these ideas. He was trying to live this fabricated life on the surface, and he had all of this like malcontent, disgruntled noise going on inside of his conscience that he never addressed, or he tried to deliberately repress, and that led to like disturbances, I would say, psychological disturbances. So in moving on to, I guess, application, what we can learn from living a transparent life, what we can learn from Dorian Gray, what we can learn from this story and these ideas from Wilde, from Dostoevsky, from Peterson, etc. First is, it's actually an entire chapter in Peterson's book. It's like, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. So telling the truth, I think living a completely transparent life is very liberating. It's very freeing. There's an idea along the lines of, if you always tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. I always like that, because you don't have to uphold any appearances. You don't have to uphold any like social contracts or expectations or superfluous ideals. You are just authentically who you are in every situation. You're not really putting a mask on or playing a role for particular social groups or particular friends or anything like that. You would have to remember, oh, this person knows me as this character. I have to play this character. That's not being authentic. That's not living a transparent life, I would say. And that could be a quick slippery slope into the situations that Dorian got himself into. So, and why Peterson includes the secondary preliminary phrase is, he says, don't lie. because you might not know what the truth is, of course, so I think that's a very wise thing to say, because we might not implicitly know what objective truth is, what the most effective and constructive version of truth we would have to operate with, unless we go through conscious development and address our shadow and all these things. But we all know when we are deliberately lying. Okay, we all know we are deliberately fabricating or contriving some identity. We are being superfluous. We are being superficial. We all know we are implicitly doing those things. And those things they might seem innocuous. They might seem trivial. They might seem frivolous, but they will manifest. That is a seed of, we've talked in the past about omission. That would be a sin of omission, letting something fly. It's going to manifest, and that seed is going to grow into a fruit, and it's going to bring into fruition all types of destructive effects. So I would say, in application, just tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And then realize that the more that somebody tries to fabricate and make this identity and make a believable concept into the world, the more obvious it would be to other people, I would say, or the more obvious it's going to be that your guilty conscience is going to arise from that disconnect, from like you're playing a character for somebody, and then when you're out of that scenario, when you're out of that, like that scene, you could even say, you would have a guilty conscience almost immediately, depending on the disparity of your true character and the character that you are playing or acting as an ideal, I would say. So yeah, in summarization, I would say living a transparent life is extremely freeing. It's extremely liberating. And we shouldn't contrive an identity, because either one of two consequences are going to take place. One, we will get called out from other people if they are wise and observant enough, give it enough time. You can't really hold on to that identity forever. Or two, your guilty conscience will pick you apart. So with that said, I will pass it on to Shrikant to moderate Q&A.
All right. So first, I have a few questions, a couple of things, observations and questions for you. Folks, if you want to ask questions or have comments, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. Number 4, feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, and do so courteously. All right. So I find this idea really, really fascinating. The idea of kind of real, who you are really versus appearance that you put up for yourself and others. So firstly, the idea that, you actually start loving the picture more than yourself. And then so you create this appearance, which is outside and separate from who you are. Secondly, that there is an inexorable effect of bad actions. So the bad actions are going to take a toll on you. And if you try to keep the appearance of not actually being bad, or trying to kind of preserve an appearance, something is going to give. And as you progress along that line, the separation between who you're projecting to be to the world and to yourself and who you really are, that keeps on going further and further apart. And something gives where it just kind of catches up with you. So that, I mean, it's a just amazingly profound and observant, capturing of what happens when you deviate, when you put appearance before reality. So I thought that it is just a fantastic presentation. Just the clarity, the drama in which that was brought up. All right, folks. So it's time for questions or comments. Who would like to go first? Go ahead and type exclamation mark. So it's going to be, we'll start with Julie, followed by MP. Julie.
Hi. I guess this is a question. It's being kind of transparent about something that I have a hard time with sometimes, which is my identity. And sometimes I get confused about being authentic, because in trying to identify what I feel and what do I want to feel, it's a matter of choice too. So I get a little confused there. I also get a little confused about where acting as if becomes denial, and where allowing something is giving it more energy and making it more solid. That's it. things.
Okay, yeah. So to the first point, to the identity, I've talked about this. We've talked about this in the past in this group. I think it's effective to, this is actually kind of congruent to what Shrikant was just saying with this identity, with this superficial appearance thing, with an identity, when you're trying to like, I guess, pin it down in a sense, or design it, or design, like you're saying, your future ideal, you can say, because you're saying you're acting as if you're proposing the future with this, with the in the present state of mind. I would say we should identify with philosophies and attributes and not identify with forms. So elaborating on a little bit, if we were to identify with forms, this would be the roles that we play. So this would be, a lot of people implicitly do this. This is a superficial like manifestation of what we choose to express ourselves through. It's the tool. It's not it's the vehicle, and it's not the actual person. So for example, if somebody asks you who you are, a lot of people will implicitly answer with roles. I am a construction worker, I'm an accountant, I'm a business person, I'm a salesman, I'm a father, I'm this, I'm that. These are all roles, right? These are just like these tools we use to express ourselves through. Rather, if we say I'm the type of person who XYZ, if we implemented, philosophies and attributes, we can express those into any particular realm that we want to. So example, if I say I am someone who loves facilitating discussion for people to mutually explore profoundly impactful ideas, that's a very transferable skill. I can be a public speaker. I can be a event planner. I can be, you know what I mean? There's so many different things I can do with that skill. If I said I am insert role here, that is very constrictive. It is very limiting in terms of I have to express myself through this limited channel. It's like this big influx of energy and attention, and it has only this little small sliver to express itself through. Whereas if you talk with identities in terms of your philosophies and your attributes, that is expansive and it's expressive, if all of that makes sense. And then the second point of your comment, acting as if, I don't think it would be fabricated unless you were acting too far into the future, if that makes sense. So I do think we should act as if our future self were in the current moment. And I think it would feel fabricated. It would feel inauthentic. It would feel like this cognitive dissonance if we're acting too far. If we're acting as like the me in like 10 years, right? That might be a little bit too forced. It might be a little bit too far out of my abilities or comfort zone or talents or strengths. But if we act as like the me in 6 months or 1 year, or even just like a step ahead of my position in my work or something, or at my job, that can be an effective way, because you're still tethered to your base of knowledge, but you're just exploring you still have one foot on that like realm of your information. You're exploring with the other foot or other hand, if that makes sense.
Excellent. Next up, I like Stefan's comment that Peterson said in all his decades of practicing clinical psychology, he's noticed that no one ever gets away with anything. That's great. Okay, so next up is going to be Judith, Jean, Dave, and Neer. Judith.
Yeah, so Jordan Peterson, I was just listening to something this evening, a clip of his where he was talking about being your authentic self. And the things, maybe John wants to just comment his thoughts on it too. The things he said is that most of the things that come out of our mouths, and most of the things we say are not our own thoughts anyway. They're thoughts that have been put there. So he was saying for 2 weeks, just pay really close attention to what you're saying. And when you realize you're saying something that doesn't really come from yourself, that comes from something from somewhere else or something else, because you're trying to be something else or say something else or pretend that you know something else, to just stop right as soon as you realize it. And he also said that usually when you do say things that are not truly authentic, you can feel it physically in your body. And yeah, so that's, I was wondering if John had any comments about that.
Yeah, actually, Shrikant has actually talked about this book a lot, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler. This point is actually relevant to that, because when I read this book, this particular section was profoundly impactful in that way. If somebody, asked me, what did I get out of philosophy? What did I get out of this particular book or this psychology book? I would always, basically backing up for a second, after I read How to Read a Book, I realized I was reading improperly. Okay. So it's kind of a meta subject, how to read a book. It's a book on how to read a book. And I realized that the books that I had read in the past, I wasn't understanding them. I wasn't interpreting them. I was memorizing their contents. That's completely different from understanding, right? Richard Feynman, on his blackboard before he died, he left behind a quote that said, "If I can't build it, I don't understand it." It's one of my favorite ideas that in the whole realm of science. And it's basically, there's a Feynman technique where it says, if you can't explain something simply enough to an 8-year-old, you don't understand it, right? And furthermore, if you can't get away from the author's terminology, quotes, if you can't get away from their particular language, and you can't put it in your own words, so to speak, you're memorizing it and you haven't understood it, right? And I think that would be the equivalent of like what Peterson is kind of addressing. It's like, you want to fabricate that appearance of like an intellectual identity. You want to be, associated with that realm of thinking or whatever reason you're doing it. But if you can't, in short, I think the way behind that is to put it in your own words and substantiate an idea with your own life experiences. So if you learn a philosophical concept or a psychological principle, you can say, okay, when in my life was that relevant? What do I have in my base of experience? That's the most important thing, experience, like an empiricist approach, that I can anchor that principle to. And then it becomes more authentic in part of your, you could say, psychological arsenal, if you will. So I think that's the number one way to kind of get around that. Put things in your own words and anchor them to your experiences. And if you can't, you might have a little bit more like introspection to do in terms of understanding the concept that a author is promulgating.
I love that. I like that.
Excellent. You know what, John, there are lots of interesting questions about karma. I don't know whether you've had a chance to read them, but let me just respond to that. I think the root of karma, I don't think of that as a concept much, but what happens is
我
that
开会，你先等一下，我要发言了。
hold on for a second, Gene.
Oh, sorry.
So what happens is that your kind of unconscious, your automatic faculties are always listening to everything that you do. So if you're being dishonest, if you're doing bad things, it has impact on you. I mean, forget about other people. It has impact on you. It impairs your ability to see clearly. It impairs your ability to act. And that is an inexorable impact on you. That is what this is showing, regardless of how people reacted to Dorian Gray. If he was being bad, it will have impact on his psyche. And that is what people try to capture with karma. So there is very much internal. And what happens is that the same thing happens in social relations. It's not as direct, but I think internally it is far more direct. You are going to get impacted for sure, whether how much you're going to pay and when you're going to pay, kind of at a social level major. So any thoughts, John?
Yeah, a principle that I've exemplified to try to internalize that is the following phrase: act as if you are always being watched. Okay, and that's like a practice in integrity, right? And you might say, oh, that's foolish. Sometimes I'm in private, sometimes I do these things, no one knows. That's not true. You are always being watched by your future self through your memories, right? So you can't escape that, even if it's your future self. You're looking back and you are either going to be regretful or proud of the decisions you're making right now. They don't vanish, right? Nothing absolutely goes away, especially, if we're psychologically sound, like you're saying, we have this conscience, we have this guilt complex, we have this like element of shame that's going to express itself in like these very furtive and subtle ways in these outlets. Because like I was talking about earlier with like Jung, there's going to be, you can't just have something and you press it down. It's going to come out somewhere eventually, whether it's unconscious or in a relationship or in some type of pattern in your life that keeps happening to you, or for you rather. It's going to come back and bite you. So I do see like a psychological substantiation of karma in that way.
Excellent. Next up is Gene, Dave, Neer, and Barry. Gene, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to second about that integrity. I want to give some example. Like we all know Hugh Grant, an English patient, they both cheat in their relationship, and they used to be very handsome. Used to be my favorite actors, and they all look terrible right now. So I think we actually pay with our appearance. Like when we're younger, we get it from our parents. After 30, all our look actually come from our own character. So if we lie or don't have integrity, then we actually pay with our look. So I have a question actually is some people, because I have bad memory, so I try not to lie because it's too much work to create alternate like universe. But some people, I think they don't really lie, but they just keep being mysterious. I have a roommate. She's very pretty, and she always like keep distance and mystery. And people can use imagination, create all this, because people have very powerful imaginations. I just wonder, also in leadership too, they mention about how you have to keep distance from your employee to create mystery. That's actually create power. So I want to see what your opinion on that.
Yeah, I mean, implicitly, like, it's kind of funny you brought that example up of like the people who were they were cheating. They were at one point, you know, you said attractive. I think it's very interesting. It's actually relevant to the, you know, the concluding statement that I brought up from the painter in the actual stories. Like sin, you can't hide the sin. Like, it shows itself on a man's face, right? And I think that's absolutely true. And even if it's not like physically exhibited, it can be psychologically like picked out from an observant eye, right? And I think we are going to meet people at the level of our conscious development, right? So in other words, I'm going to see in you what I see in myself, and vice versa, right? Whatever I don't like or admire about you or hate about you or whatever, or triggers me, it's usually a reflection, like we usually project onto people, or the phenomenon of psychological displacement happens a lot in interpersonal relationships. So I don't think, if we're like trying to live an authentic life and have actual meaningful, deep connections with people, those are predicated on vulnerability and authenticity. And I think if you were going to live this superficial life, you are in turn only going to have superficial relationships, because the only people who are not going to be able to see through those things would be shallow people, or they would be people that they would be doing a similar thing. They're not trying to expose themselves to a world in a vulnerable manner. They would only try to, okay, I'm going to exhibit this appearance. I'm going to play this role. I'm going to play this character. And like, you're only going to meet characters if you're living in that way. You're not going to meet somebody who's authentically themselves, because they would see right through that. You know what I mean? So it's all going to be a projection or extension of that. So I think the relationship we have with ourselves sets the governor, or sets the precedent, you can say, for all of other relationships in our lives.
So next up is Dave, Near, Barry, and Ayala. Dave.
Thanks, Shrikant, and great presentation, John. Looking at a little different perspective, it seems like this young man has sensed that the present day is the peak of his life. And true for a handsome man or a beautiful woman, it's very impressive. It seemed like he wants to stop time and maintain, as I said, a little different way of looking at it, but maintain this peak. And I look at my life, and I've had ups and downs, and I wouldn't trade it for the world. It's, you know, part of wisdom and a journey. But anyway, just your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's at the end of the day, he wanted, you can say his prime motive would be like social validation or praise or compliments or something. And he could have got that through moral work or character or ethical cultivation, right? But that's hard, right? That's very difficult. So he didn't want to do that. He chose the easy route of like, okay, a lot of people value beauty. And he did have, like I said, subversive influence, like I said, from Lord Henry. He was kind of a very malleable, impressionable, susceptible young man. Lord Henry was this like person who was placing so much emphasis on the aesthetic, on the physical, on beauty. So he kind of got subversively influenced by that idea and by that philosophy, you can say. And he wanted that praise without the hard work. So in a sense, there was two outlets to do it. He could be like the superficial way. Short term, it provided it a little bit. You can say it kind of met those needs, it alleviated that desire. But long term, obviously, it came crashing down on him. So there's only one, I would say, long term way, and that's personal development.
Excellent. Next up is going to be Near, Barry, Ayala, Sarika, Deborah, and Kevin. Near, go ahead.
So I think that we want, on one hand, we want to be free and we want to have self-expression to the maximum. But on the other hand, we want connection with people. And in order to connect with people, we need to fit somehow into what they're looking for. And so we're struggling between, let's say, if I'm working at a certain job, I want to fit that job. So I have to adapt myself to the culture of that job. I want to have maximum self-expression within that culture, but I can't be completely authentic. Or even in a relationship, in a close relationship, you can be completely authentic and be alone, or you can try to adapt yourself to the relationship to some extent, and you have to constantly balance these two forces. So that's the problem that I see around this.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I can see some element of compromise in a lot of relationships. But I think the unifying force would be, going back to one of the for answers to the first questions, would be the unifying force could be like a principle or a philosophy. I know a lot of jobs and careers and things like this, they usually state like their principles. Here's our belief statement, here's our mission. And that is something that's going to garner all of them together to attach their identity with, if that makes sense. So obviously all the constituents of a particular organization or career or workplace or company has their different version of authenticity, has their different idiosyncrasies and interests and passions, etc. But they're all unified by this intangible attribute or a philosophy or a mission or value. You know what I mean? So that would be something that is not, I would say, not necessarily as negotiable, like the values, the intangibles. And I think the forms, going back to the others, again, going back to the first answer that I had for one of the questions, if that's where most of the discrepancies would manifest themselves, in the forms. If I say, okay, I'm this, and my friend is this, my friend has this career, my other friend has that career, but we all have mutual values. So that's why we are always able to connect and negotiate with like our own individual values and like desires and being authentic in our own way, but still have that connection because there's still something in common. Does that make sense?
Next up, give me just a second. Next up is Barry, Ayala, Sarika, Deborah, Kevin, and Faye. Barry?
For several years, I taught a class called Engineering Economics. And engineering economics, in a nutshell, means being able to evaluate the cost and benefits of your decision. So I asked the question, what is the cost and the benefit of being authentic? We can stand here and be philosophical and say all these wonderful things and read wonderful books, but there is a cost with being authentic. Let's not fool ourselves. I spent my life being authentic. I'm an INTJ on a Myers-Briggs, and it's probably one of the most authentic personality you can imagine. Honesty is etched in my DNA. And my father tried to teach me to be dishonest, but I didn't. And I, right after my wife died, I went to a class on dating. And the woman said, if you want to have a lot of dates, you got to sell yourself. And selling yourself means putting out the best part of yourself. And I raised my hand. I said, but that isn't really me. That's not true. And she did. And she never invited me back again. So so most of the world system is teaching you to fit in. And there is a cost in being part of that system if you're too authentic. I'm just saying that, and so we need to be honest about this. We can say, that Oscar Wilde, it was very wise in all what he said, but I think there's another side of the coin. We need to be honest and realize there is a cost and not just talk about just the benefits of being authentic. And I've experienced that in my life. So I could write a book about it, in fact.
I agree. I am also an INTJ, so we must think alike because I anticipated that question coming up. That is the third question for the breakout group. What is the cost of authenticity? So we must think alike. So we'll address it in the breakout group.
Excellent. Next up.
That's funny.
Next up is Ayala, followed by Sarika and Deborah. Ayala.
Yes, I was going to start also with Neil and Barry about the disadvantage, the social disadvantage sometimes, being too authentic. Because there is a part in us that's social and want to connect, and another part individual that wants our own boundaries. And they will keep clashing. So, John, I don't know if always there is this harmony of the two, although, of course, that would be the ideal. But the benefit of authenticity, like you, Barry, in my life, is qualitative. We can't measure it. It's what Dorian Gray is experiencing is a deep alienation. No guilt and shame. He's not a person who will feel guilty. He's kind of sociopathic, right? But the alienation from self is the price that usually Kant were speaking about. The feeling of emptiness of the real me, the lack of presence. And there is always a fear, kind of a lurking fear for the day that he will have to stand in front of the mirror. Mm-hmm. If you remember what happened when finally the picture broke and he saw himself. So, to live in harmony with self, I think, is a greater benefit than to live in harmony with a particular community that you live in.
Yeah. I agree with that last comment. Also, there's the notion of, I don't even know if it would be guilt on Dorian's behalf, but there was some vestige of negative emotion because and this was hidden in the fact that he hid the painting, right? So he couldn't deal with it. There was some negative, like visceral gut reaction to what was exemplified on that canvas. And he said, I can't associate with this. I can't even look at it. That might not be guilt. It might be disgust. It might be shame. It didn't really articulate much. I read it a little while ago too, so I don't vividly remember his particular reaction. Also important to note, Deborah actually just put this in the chat recently, not everybody has the same level of attachment or identification with a conscience. This is not a universal, okay, everybody has the same voice in their head and it's saying the same thing at the same ethical weight, right? That's an entirely different subject in and of itself. We would have to dive into in a later meetup. But he definitely had some manifestation of negative behavior because there was a disconnect. He wasn't living authentically with himself, and there was a detriment. There was some seedling of malevolence in him that he couldn't stomach, and then obviously that led to his downfall, I would say.
Next up is Sarika, Deborah, Kevin, Faye, and Jennifer. Sarika, go ahead.
Okay, hi. I had 2 points, but I'll try and make it really, really short. So the first one is about speaking to the cost benefit analysis of authenticity, and in particular maybe man's hubris and wanting to create wealth in this life, and maybe even looking at Dorian Gray as the quintessential American manifest destiny man, and the painting is kind of what he's really doing to the rest of the world, or what we have done to the rest of the world in terms of exploiting other cultures and economies, the rest of our humanity, which is confusing because that's just a thought I had. And the second point was about feminism, and speaking to one of the other ladies that spoke about fitting in to society and the cost of being authentic and the roles that are societally enforced. I may want to be authentic. My parents and my ex-boyfriend do not accept that. And it's really difficult for me to say, I have my own ideas about the world. I'm not going to take on whatever traditional roles. I don't have those beliefs. I can't integrate with that. But, it's really difficult as a woman to step through these boundaries, especially when men are very preoccupied with aesthetics. And there are a lot of, just in the same way, the hubris of man historically has unthinkingly exploited other cultures, only to look back and say, hey, let's be socially, environmentally conscious now. In the same way, the things have happened to women, the intelligence of women, and it's really heartbreaking. Just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I actually really like, I'll try to address both in a short comment. I never even looked at that analogy of like the, culture versus like the exploitation of other cultures. I think that is actually a very unique perspective. It's very creative. I never looked at it that way. But I would still err on the side of like individual authenticity over like collective identification with particular roles or groups. I don't have time to get into it right now, but we did an entire discussion on Candide and individualism versus collectivism. Shrikant has all these meetups on YouTube if you ever want to check that out. I kind of addressed tangentially related and tertiary points on that particular topic of like collective identity versus individual responsibility in terms of like fixing what you should approach in the world in that regard. And then second, absolutely, you're completely right. There is a large social, it's largely most, I would say, social cost of authenticity. It is not going to be praised. It's not going to be celebrated. What was it? Orwell says, no man is, or I think this is Plato, no man is hated more than he who speaks the truth. Orwell said, the more society drifts from truth, the more it will hate those who speak it. Plato was along the lines of, if you are able to see beyond the lies and falsehoods of the masses, of your culture, you will never be believed, let alone understood by the masses. So all this, like this echo, these sentiments have been echoed throughout history of like individual authenticity. You're not going to have approval. You're not going to have like external praise, but that's actually kind of related to what we're going to be talking about next week in terms of internal validation versus external validation. So if you're interested in a topic like that, we can get into next week and we can dive into. But in short, I guess one like phrase to remember: never trade your authenticity for approval. It's not worth it.
Next up is Deborah, Kevin, Faye, and Jennifer. Deborah?
Okay, so a theme that I was thinking about with the book was that, at least in the beginning, I feel like there's this idea of sort of finding a proxy. And so like they say that, I mean, the main theme, right, is the whole thing with Dorian Gray and the painting. But I felt like even in the beginning, like when they talk about the artist, Basil, whatever his name was, how he describes like throwing himself into his art, and that's how he feels like he's most reflected. And also the thing with that Lord Henry Wotton, I thought to like an obsessive degree, he wants to influence people. And that was also like everyone else is sort of a proxy for him, kind of like a reflection for him. So I guess like my question was, it's more of an opinion question, I guess, for you, John. If you're seeking to reflect yourself in others, is that like maybe an initial attempt at strengthening authenticity? Because if you're thinking like, okay, well, here's a proxy for me, but I am sort of imprinting myself on this, or I'm aware of who I am. But then you're misplacing it maybe, or is it sort of the exact opposite because it's not an internal thing? Like you were kind of, I guess you were just hitting on this, the idea of external, not validation, but external versus internal. Not sure if that makes sense. But like,
so what do you mean? What do you mean in particular? Like if I'm looking for a trait in somebody, or if I'm looking for a particular instance that I want to find in myself, I find it in other people first? Like, what do you mean?
Like if you use someone else as a template, like the whole thing with like Lord Henry Wotton, like he's like, oh, I like influencing people. I want to hear my ideas like repeated back. But instead of just expressing them myself, I'll kind of just see how it plays out with other people. Is that just kind of a misdirected way of like strengthening who you are? Or is that sort of the opposite? It's not being true to yourself at all because you're just kind of doing this to other people. And it's not like, I don't know, expressing yourself, I guess, if that makes sense.
I would look at it as the latter, because if he actually wanted to implement his ideals and, espouse his philosophy unto the world, he would have to execute on that for a myriad of reasons. I think the main one is that he has all types of idiosyncratic nuances and context to measure the consequences of his philosophy in the world. And if he espouses it unto other people, I think it's directly commensurate and proportionate. Like the less authentic somebody is, you could say the more like preachy they might be, because they're trying to have all these people accept their ideals because they don't want to have, you could say almost like in a sense of accepting responsibility for it. You know what I mean? They're trying to avoid the criticism. They're trying to avoid the failures. They're trying to avoid the pitfalls and the mistakes and the criticism and the social isolation and all the consequences and all the negative attributes that comes along with fortifying that philosophy against boundaries. That's how everything is formed and strengthened from opposition. So I think that's like a very weak way of trying to formulate a philosophy without taking any of the L's, so to speak.
Next up is Kevin, Faye, Jennifer, Shelley, and Jackie. Kevin, go ahead.
One way we can look at this, what's the motivation for, let's see, Dorian look at? Is the young pictures by the older one? And he also try express himself authentic, good way. So if let's see, can we think our a value system or a culture of values different? Why younger is better than older? You know, I would say it's from another level, hierarchy level above. How do you identify the good or bad? The definition of handsome or beautiful. What do you think? Thank you.
Can you rephrase the question? How to identify if a value is good or bad?
Yeah, that's our value system, I guess. Can we stay, let's see, the truth is about, can we have objective value rather than subjective defined by authority or other people defined?
Okay.
That's from historically, right? We already defined, like, you are good looking, I'm bad. Why like that, right?
Yeah. That's a very, very, very complex topic, but I would say a simple approach is like, look at the ramifications and or consequences of acting out that ideal in the world. Or a simple thought experiment, this is from Kant actually, act as if the maxim of your action were to become through your will a immutable law of nature, right? So act as if, in short, if everybody did what you did, what does the world look like? Like a simple thought experiment. If you ran a culture if you ran some type of society or city of 100 clones of you, what is the result of that city? What is the net outcome of that city, right? Are they productive? Are they just malevolent? Are they just always at war? Like, what would be the example of that? Like, extrapolate your beliefs onto the world. You could look at it at a larger scale, like that thought experiment, or you could just look at in terms of not only how it affects you in a selfish way, like Dorian was doing, but how it affects other people. So look at like the have a social gauge and barometer of the effects that you're having on other people. I think that's a good approach to determine the merit or constructive or destructive nature of a particular value or philosophy.
Next up is Faye. Faye, go ahead. Faye, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I was saying that I don't really have a question. I just had the same thoughts that Nir, Barry, and Ayala spoke about, which is essentially that, yes, living this transparent life can be liberating, but at the same time, it can also be detrimental, right? Depending on the society that you're in, the time and the place. And I thought about just homosexuality and being openly gay in a place like maybe Iran versus the US, right? And how, like, yes, in the US, it would be, it's liberating to express that side of yourself, but in a society where that's not okay, where that's not the predominant culture, or that or that minority, I guess, is not welcomed, that's a risk to your life, really. So yeah, it was just a thought more than a question, but I imagine we'll talk about this later in the breakout rooms.
Yeah. The third question is, what are the prices of authenticity? What's the price of authenticity? So it'd be we'll talk about it.
So next up is Jennifer, Shelley, and Jackie. Jennifer.
Hi, everybody. I'm making dinner and chopping onions, so if I'm all teary-eyed, that's why. So I just typed a couple comments on the in the chat as I was just kind of stream of conscious of things. I had experiences with two clients, and I tend to be somebody who's fairly open and honest and transparent. There's not a whole lot, the heart's right here, both the intellectual heart and the emotional heart. And one of my clients last year completely shocked me by taking advantage of me to the tune of $4,600. He just didn't pay his last invoice. I never saw this coming. I have no idea why he treated me in this way. It didn't seem to me to be in keeping with his character. And I was wondering if this was some sort of projection of who I wondered if, like, perhaps he thought I was taking advantage of him because he would be given to taking advantage of me, and then therefore decided to stiff me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would think it was more him trying to take advantage in the sense of going back to the metaphor we were discussing earlier with like the pond thing. So Walden was talking about like, oh, if you can't see the bottom of something, you assume it's just like, you don't know what it is. So you're just going to make a bunch of assumptions. But if somebody is authentic, in other words, like their water is completely transparent, you can see to the bottom, there's nothing that's convoluted. There's no obfuscation. There's no complex. I'm not gonna say there's no complexities, but there obviously is complexity. They can see like your true character. That is admirable, and like unfortunately people can take advantage of that because they see like they can project into the future and plot things and say, okay, I'm going to push this button and see the response. I'm going to see that they're very authentic, they're very open, so I'm going to know their weak spots, assuming if they're completely vulnerable or if they're completely authentic, somebody would be vulnerable, which leads to growth, which leads to connection, which is admirable. Unfortunately, this might be, falling into the realm of the breakout group, but like that could be just the price of authenticity. You know what I mean? Maybe just people tend to exploit that or take advantage of that, unfortunately. But I mean, that's their own, going back to the whole thing with guilt and conscience and karma, that's something they have to deal with.
All right, last three questions are from Shelley, Jackie, and Jonathan. Shelley, go ahead.
So it appears to me that the character in this book doesn't really want to be transparent, right? But I think it would be worthwhile to think about what are situations in life where we don't want to be transparent, and what can we do as people to work towards being more transparent or helping those around us to be more transparent. I think about, as I've raised my children, and I think about when, I just had an incident with one of my boys where he started to say something, but then he stopped because he was going to be embarrassed. So he didn't want to be, that kind of transparent self. He didn't want to admit he didn't know something, And so I think as we read books like this, it would also be good to evaluate in terms of ourselves and transparency. So I just wanted to make that comment. John, if you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's actually really relevant to our second question in the breakout group. So yeah, we can address it there. I think it's perfectly pertinent to that one.
Great, thank you.
All right, last one is by, I forgot now, who is it?
It was me.
Jackie, yes, go ahead.
Yes, it's kind of dovetails the prior speaker. I was curious if you think this is teachable. Can we cultivate this? Authenticity and honesty. Is there a particular thought pattern that you have around that?
Yes. Emphasis on internal validation. I mean, it's kind of a two-part thing, but we're going to get into that next week. Trying to completely dispense with any significance that criticism has over you, and also really, really mitigate and relegate and subordinate the importance that a lot of praise might have on you too. So it's both ways. It's just anything external, like having that opinion, having that data rather influence your opinion, I think we should more so move on the side of what we were talking about earlier with how can you be sure to understand a piece of work, a piece of fiction. A lot of people, I think it was Shelley or somebody was bringing up something that they read from Jordan Peterson or something that they heard. And the idea that we kind of just like parrot other people's ideas. We parrot what we've read. We do these things. Similarly, a lot of us do it with our self-image if we're not careful, right? So it's like people can either praise us or criticize us, and if we're not careful, if we don't consciously reject those thoughts, they become right into our subconscious mind, right into our identity. So I think that would be the secondary caveat to saying, making it teachable, place emphasis on internal validation, and that's literally an entire different meetup we're going to do next week.
Excellent.
I didn't hear anything about morality in there. Is there a piece of morality that you believe is for a person to be honest and authentic? What do you
mean? Can you rephrase it?
It's right or wrong, morality, right or wrong. This is the right thing to do, kind of thing.
I think that's very temperamental in terms of people's idiosyncrasies, people's conditioning, people's social upbringing, people's parents, you know what I mean? Because some people just implicitly don't let criticism affect them. Some people are extremely sensitive to that stuff. Some people are very, I don't want to use the word desperate, but they place a lot of reliance on external praise. They might need a lot of encouragement to move. They might need none. They might be completely self-reliant. They might be a little bit more dependent. There's all types of idiosyncrasies on that. So it's kind of hard to objectively say right or wrong. You know what I mean?
All right. So we're going to go into the breakout rooms for 20 minutes, after which we're going to come back and share our takeaways. And you can also put a question on the table, the most important question you can think of. All right. So, John, what are the questions for the breakout room?
Okay, so we have 3 questions to facilitate discussion around for the breakout room. The first one is, do you think people can evade all of the consequences of their actions long term? Can people get away with being malicious or malevolent or screwing people over? The second question are, what are the primary reasons people create masks? Or you can say that what's the biggest barrier to transparency, I guess? What's the biggest barrier to living authentically? The third point is the question, what are the downsides or the costs of authenticity and transparency?
All right, I have put the questions in the chat. So if you would like, you can copy and take it with you. So folks, I'm starting the breakout rooms now. We'll be back here in 20 minutes. Welcome back, folks. So it's time for takeaways. All right, so what we're going to do is that you can talk about your takeaways, and you can also put one question, the most important question that you have on your mind, on the table. And then we will, John and I are going to keep track of all the questions, and then we will talk about kind of common patterns that come out from the questions. All right, so I'm going to start with with people I see on the screen. So I'm going to start with Marvin, Sarika, and Maxine. Go ahead, Marvin. What was your takeaway? Oh, Marvin skips. Okay. Next one is Sarika, Maxine, and David. David R. Sarika.
Okay, so, well, we kind of veered into the realm of like the topic of political inequality in the world and the clashing of belief systems and how people reconcile with different belief systems, which is not entirely related to the
okay
book.
But what did you think of the meetup?
It was really good. I'm really looking forward to joining more, and I'll try and like read the books for the next one. So
no, you don't need to read the books. I mean, the way John sets it up is that it's focused on one idea, and that is accessible to anybody, even if they have not read the book. And we do meetups every day. So check out the calendar at 52 Living Ideas. So next up is Maxine, David, and Praveen. Maxine.
I wanted to thank you if you set up these little chat rooms, because this is the first time that I've ever gone into a room where the people spoke and I could see them. Usually I get in the room and they're all pictures and no one speaks. And when I try to speak to them, they don't answer. So therefore, I think, well, maybe they don't value my opinion, which makes me more nervous about answering. This time, everyone spoke and everyone tried to answer the questions. It was very pleasant. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So Maxine and everybody. So what happens if that occasionally that happens?
It happens to me every time.
Oh, really? Okay. So there is an easy solution. I'm always in the main room. So if you do not like, or the breakout room for any reason, you just leave the room, you come to the main room. So I know that there is a problem, and then I'll just put you in another room where there's all kinds of discussions going on everywhere. But I don't know. I'll keep an eye out for you, Maxine.
Thank you very much.
I do this on a random basis. But if there is a problem, all anybody has to do is to just leave the breakout room, come automatically to this room, and then I'll put you in another room. Okay.
Next up. Thank you. Now the next thing I wanted to tell you is, I wanted to discuss the difference between vulnerability and transparency, because I don't believe that you can be that transparent in this world. I think if you, in your workplace, if you're very transparent, you really don't get ahead. You always tell me about my stories, but I had, here's a few. My daughter was doing very poorly in French in college. And she said, oh, I'm going to flunk French. I said, no, you're not. And I went in for Parents' Day, and I went up to the French teacher and I said, oh, my daughter just loves your class. And she talks about it all the time. And he said, she does? She does? Well, I thought she looks like she's falling asleep. I said, oh no, she's taking it all in. And he gave her an A, and she became a French major.
All right.
My daughter is nauseous in your class. That wouldn't have worked. Transparency would not have done it. And I had a job.
No, Maxine, let me interrupt you, because now I'm going to let everybody else put their own thoughts on the table, and then we'll discuss everything together. Okay. Thank you, Maxine.
You're welcome.
Next up is David, Praveen, and George. David.
So first, I just want to thank John. It was a great presentation, and first time I ever kind of really heard the story behind Dorian Gray. I guess my takeaway is, as I was listening, it reminded me of something that I was told when I was many years ago, which was, be careful what you wish for, because you may get it.
Thank you, David. Next up is Praveen, George, and MP. Praveen.
So, hey guys, it's been a while. I think I came earlier this summer. So I took the track of what are the benefits of actually being inauthentic and the benefits of having a mask on. And basically in the film industry, you basically are all wearing masks, and there's some benefits to that for yourself and people around you. For example, when you look at the frame, the time frame that you're looking at too, early on, we all have to pull together, and some people aren't always going to be compensated, as they should early on. But long term, maybe it'll even out with residuals for actors, so to speak. So I think there's different points of view. Some people might feel they're exploited, but they might change their mind, et cetera. And the benefits of a mask as well is, I felt like you can become who you pretend to be long term if you pretend long enough. And that happens to actors all the time. They take on the persona of the character they're playing. Maybe it's a human trait of their consciousness as well. So that's my take.
Thank you, Praveen. Next up is George, MP, and Mark.
Great job, John. Thank you. It's been a long time since I've read The Portrait of Dorian Gray, and I need to reread it. Am I supposed to only give a takeaway, or a takeaway and a question?
Takeaway and a question.
My takeaway is that if authenticity is still an existential problem, then I think it's safe for me to infer that most people are immature. That's my takeaway. And my question is the following. Do you believe that people create masks? Because it's based on your second question. Do you believe people create masks, or are they socially constructed?
Wonderful. Great question. And we'll keep track of all the questions, all the observations, and then we'll address all of them together. Next up is MP, Mark, and Barry. MP?
So basically my takeaway is that in terms of authenticity and transparency, I think that some people higher on the social strata could gain from not being authentic and putting their masks on and being deceitful and being misaligned with who they are, just because of who they are and what they are. And I see that. So, I don't want to go on a soapbox about apartheid and how that plays into our society, but I think that's really something to look at, the interaction between one's conscience or lack thereof and what one has to gain from authenticity and transparency. Also, a question that I have is, can one be authentically amoral or immoral?
Thank you. Thank you, MP. Next up is Mark, Barry, and Merrill. Mark.
Okay, so on this concept of authenticity, to me, it gets to this idea that people call the true self. But no, that's a whole topic to me of saying like, well, how do you know what your true self is? Like, I'm always Mark. I'm always the one in the situation performing the actions. So I think it's a feeling people have that they feel like they would prefer to have done something differently. So then, but you're doing it based on outside forces. So if you're doing it consciously, you're saying, I'm consciously behaving this way so I don't lose my job. Well, I don't think you're being inauthentic when you do that at all. But now the other term for authenticity is like whether you're being honest in communicating with other people. And I think that's what a lot of people object to. That you're not effectively communicating. You're not showing your true self to people, maybe. And there's dangers in that, which we talked about in the group. But what I wanted to raise here is this idea that people seem to think in this group, not everybody, but this has been an underlying assumption that we recognize authenticity when we encounter it. And I would question that, because like most of the science that I know about us is humans are much better liars than we are lie detectors. Yeah, if you spend a lot of time with somebody and form a strong relationship, yes, absolutely, I would agree. It's hard to fake it for that long. But in casual contact in our large non-tribal societies, where the way we interact with our leaders, for example, I don't think we can detect lack of authenticity at all. And I'm interested in whether people agree with me or disagree with me.
Very nice, Mark. Next up is Barry, Merrill, and Deborah. Barry.
Yeah, I want to thank John for introducing me to the real Dorian Gray. I thought the Dorian Gray was an airplane that dropped an atomic bomb on the Hiroshima. But but anyway, my takeaway is that my trajectory is to be more authentic as I get older. Of course, I have the benefit I'm retired. I don't have to work. I have a pension. I have a government pension. I have a home. I have a girlfriend. I have everything I need to live. So, but I have experienced the pain of rejection. And there is a part of the brain they found that actually is activated where it's associated with pain. But it turns out, and I'm going to be talking about this in my presentation, being a super ager, that the same part of the brain that activates when you're rejected or you experience grief also activates your creativity. And I found that when I'm rejected and then I spend more time alone, that's when I really accomplish something. You cannot self-actualize and socialize at the same time. You have to make a choice. And I want to leave you with the question, is it more important to self-actualize, or is it more important to socialize and fit in? That is a fundamental question everybody needs to ask in their life.
That was amazing, Barry. And I'm going to give a plug for your presentation because I think, let me go ahead and do it right now. I mean, one of the key things that both Dave and Kevin brought up is the attempt to hold on to the youth. And they're trying to actually pretend to be young, that, and trying to kind of say that, okay, I will not age. I will try to pretend, kind of have the appearance of young, of being, of having youth. Firstly, that is against life. And you basically end up doing a whole bunch of things against yourself. I mean, youth is like you're given kind of a starting capital, and that you have to use it in order to build a character with which you can build something. Most people don't do that. If you do that, then you can actually use the youth as a takeoff point for the rest of your life. But if you say that I want to have the appearance of youth, and that's all I care about, then you basically stop growing, and then all kinds of weird things happen. Now, what Barry is going to be talking about is how to be a super ager. How do you keep growing throughout your life? What does it take? what are the challenges, and what are the various things we can do. And that's going to be on 23rd of December. So consider that as a gift to yourself and look forward to seeing you there. Next up is going to be Mariel, Deborah, and Jean. Mariel.
So my takeaway is that there is a delicate balance between being too authentic and not revealing enough of yourself. And you are walking the tightrope to between that, especially for people, let's say, in the entertainment industry, or who have to assume very professional roles and demeanors at work. So that's...
Thank you. Thank you, Mariel. Next up is going to be Deborah, Jean, and Jennifer. Deborah.
Okay, so I think how much you share of yourself is very dependent on your own personality and experiences. And so authenticity to oneself, I think, can look different to different people. And then my question would be, I guess, is being deliberately deceptive the only way to be inauthentic? Because if every facet of yourself is you, aren't you always being authentically you, but you're just expressing a different side of yourself?
Thank you, Deborah. Next up is Jean, Jennifer, and Jairo. Jean.
Yeah, I think to reveal authentic self, we have to first develop ourselves. And in order to reveal ourselves to others, we have to be happy with ourselves. So the first step, we have to accepting ourselves. You know, even though we know our strengths and weakness, we know our shortcoming and our strengths, so we don't really threatened when they reveal ourselves, when people point out our shortcoming, because we already know. I think that's what confidence is. If you don't understand ourselves, if we don't accept ourselves, there's no way we can reveal ourselves to others, because we're full of vulnerability. Another thing, I think I agree with what Barry mentioned. You know, like if you reveal yourself, then there's a chance you will not fit in. There's a chance people like you and some people hate you because you're very unique. So I have this theory. I see people, if you think people is a product, we have different type of product. There's a product that's sold by their beauty. Their product sold by their utility. Their product sold by their uniqueness. So I already see we sell ourselves to the society through job. We sell ourselves to others through marriage. That's my analogy. And how you market yourself. I never hide myself because I just want to live who I am. So you can accept me, you can don't like me, that's fine, you know. So I want to be unique. That's my product line. You can be, everybody can choose their own product line. What do you want to be, as long as you're happy with it. So I think in the end, you choose your life, you choose yourself, and choose who you are, and just be happy with it.
Okay, wonderful. Next up is going to be Jennifer, Jairo, and M. Jennifer, what's your takeaway?
So I guess the takeaway in our discussion group, we talked about the difference between how vulnerability and transparency are related to gullibility. So that would be a subject for further discussion, because I don't think we came up with a very good answer to that. One of the things I was thinking about is the Carl Jung quote that I posted about loneliness is, I can't remember if it right off the bat, but I was also thinking about, in terms of a question, there's a story that I read in graduate school. It's called San Manuel Bueno, Martyr, Saint Martin, the Good Martyr. And it's about a Catholic priest in this small town in Spain who he's lost faith. He doesn't believe what he's teaching people, but yet for the good of the village, he maintains his position as priest. And he performs all the duties of a priest with all the love of a priest and with all the zeal of a priest. And so I guess my question arises out of, okay, so in that case, he's not being transparent and it's for the good of the society. Are there other places where we can not be transparent, but for the good, for some larger good?
Okay, thank you. Next up is Jairo, M, and Ayala. Jairo?
So I heard a lot of things like in our break room. We talked about masks, like wearing masks, and and then it occurred to me that why in negotiations in business they want you to drink, and if you don't drink in a certain social situations, then you're not trusted as much. So maybe the purpose of having a drink or two, well, not to get drunk, but it's supposedly to let your guard down or remove your mask that you might be trying to real hard to show. And then later on after that break room, I heard about the authentic self, or maybe not that exactly. So I was thinking, so what is that? Isn't it like when we're talking, like in games people play, if it's me with a parent, I put on a mask for the parent, and me with a child, I put a mask for the child, and with friends. So I'm putting on different masks in different situations. So what is, or who is my authentic self really? So maybe I'm thinking there isn't one, or we're trying to create it, and maybe we can change it at will if we're skillful at it.
Thank you, Jairo. Next up is M, Ayala, and Faye. M.
So my takeaway is we cannot be authentic or transparency at any place or to anyone, only because I mean there's many personality out there, right? We have manipulator or narcissist. So by being transparency to the wrong people can pretty much just become very dangerous. So that's a big cost of it.
Thank you, M. Next up is Ayala, Faye, and Lloyd. Ayala.
Yeah, I'm glad people bring some distinctions here with transparency has in it, it seems to be related to privacy, and privacy does not negate necessarily being authentic or authenticity. So we kind of have to use nuance here. Vulnerability is related to authenticity, but also only statistically, because people who are vulnerable can be authentic, but it is harder. It is harder. It involves more risks, as Maxine noted. But Dorian Gray himself had a lot, his lack of authenticity seems to be related to very, very deep narcissism and sociopathy. He was to exploit, he was a taker, and he used the acting to use people and to get admiration. So it's very much like our president.
Thank you, Ayala. Next up is Faye, Lloyd, and Stefan. Faye?
Yeah, thanks, Shakan. Great presentation as always, John. To me, it may be a little bit off track, but the problem of life being unfair, and we're a very unequal society, that some people feel justified, whether it's robbing the liquor store or becoming a computer hacker to get up or to get back and get even. So anyway, just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Faye, Faye M, followed by Lloyd, followed by Julie. Faye, okay. Next up is Lloyd, Stefan, and Julie. Lloyd.
John made an interesting point about Dorian Gray being a sociopath. And I do think, I never thought of that before, but I think the way we're using the book makes a lot of sense as a jumping off point to transparency and authenticity, because as a character, it is a little hard to relate to Dorian because he is a sociopath. There's no guilt there from ruining a lot of people's lives. So I think we're using the book in a very productive way.
Thank you. Next up is Stefan, Julie, and Steph. Stefan?
Yeah, so in our group, there were two topics that came up that I consolidated in my head, and I had an idea about it. So one was the question of what's the downside to being authentic, and the other one, well, the other topic was meditation. So over the summer, I spent an hour a day for 2 months just meditating, but meditating in a way where I was like trying to really actively have a conversation with myself, like a back and forth. And I found that was an extremely helpful way for me to get down to like who I really was. And the only downside, if you want to call it that, along the way was there's like there might be some demons that you might approach doing this if you try it, which I highly recommend along the way, like really old stuff. It's almost like cleaning out your email inbox. It's like, holy Christ, I have something from like 10 years ago in there that's really, really scary and heavy. But once you look at it and process that, then it's like a little bit of garbage is out of your mental system.
Thank you, Stefan. That's very impressive. That kind of regular meditation and what it'll do for you. Next up is Julie, Steph, and Judith. Julie.
I would disagree that transparency, people don't like it, because I think most of the Emerson, Thoreau, a lot of people, I admire people that are transparent. And when I run into transparency, it's like a light. And I think it builds trust in a world where what you see is not what you get. And it's just a world of mask based on fear. And I think that even sharing your own secrets, I think you're only as sick as your secrets. The moment you're able to be transparent about it, it gives other people permission to take off their masks and be honest too. So I aspire towards being transparent and being free and not compromising. I think it also, someone who's transparent, who's got a commitment to values more than a fear of being not, rejected or anything. It's a powerful thing, but I think you got to know kind of what your values are, and you got to do that kind of work to get to that place where you are a light of transparency. Because if you're being compulsively transparent, that's not the same thing.
Thank you, Julie. Next up is Steph, Judith, and Roberto. Steph?
I don't have a whole lot to say other than, Julie, I appreciate your authenticity. You were in my group and I was with Maxine. It was a very good discussion group, and I felt like we were authentic there. So that was nice. That's it.
Thank you, Steph. Next up is Judith, Roberto, and PC.
Okay, so many interesting comments. I like the idea that I brought up, transparency and privacy are different from authenticity. I liked what Julie said about confidence, because I think if you have confidence in who you are, and you present that at the right time in the right places, then your authenticity shines through, and maybe it garners respect a lot of times, but I don't know all the times. I was interested in what Praveen was saying about movies and stories, because I was thinking of, young people and musicians, artists type people who use masks as part of their persona to explore the world and see who they want to be and where they want to go. So it's a way of finding your authentic self, sometimes trying on different masks. Let's see. So with all of these ideas, and Mark talked about feeling, that feeling that you wish you had done something differently. And that kind of rings true for me a lot too. When I try to evaluate, am I authentic or not? I can tell by how I feel, oh, I just wasn't authentic right at that moment. So it's like a very visceral kind of a feeling. But how it boils down to choices, I guess, and the why you choose to do what you do, you know, to be very cognizant of what you're doing to make sure that you're authentic, kind of like not consciously all the time, but just like that's a value to you to be the person you want to be, even if you're deciding you want to put a mask on at that moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Judith. Faye M., you have unmuted. Would you like to speak?
Yes,
ahead.
sorry about that. I didn't realize I was on mute earlier. Yeah, I just wanted to say my takeaways from my group when we spoke about whether or not people can get away with long-term immoral acts or with immoral acts in the long term. We all agreed that there are probably people out there that are. But Yarohi keenly pointed out that evasion and that hiding, that takes a toll on their psyche, and you know that in a way is their punishment, is their prison, so they're not really getting away with that. And there was something that Deborah brought up earlier, and you know she talked about, you know, are you really being, can you really be inauthentic? And that distinction, I guess, between being inauthentic, which is my understanding is you're doing something that you wouldn't do naturally, or you know that you, if you do, you just feel like it just was not you, and hiding some parts of yourself, that hiding certain parts of yourself is not being inauthentic. And so just that was just an interesting thing that was brought up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Faye. Next up is going to be Mike, Anna, and Kevin. Mike, I'll give you 2 minutes, sir. Mike, are you there? Is your mic working today?
Yes, it's working. Thank you. First, what is immoral and unjust obeys the principle of what you see depends on your point of view, which we get from Plato's allegory of the cave. Corollary to that is every one of us really does wear some sort of a mask, and that's probably okay. Following from that, in order to ensure domestic tranquility, so we all get along, we need to agree on a set of rules. And wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone followed them, even if those rules aren't quite right, like Peterson's 24 rules for life, or the 24,000 rules of the IRS code, or the 600 rules in the Bible. Wouldn't it be wonderful if everyone followed those rules, even if they're wrong? And the final point is Pascal's wager in a somewhat different context said what goes around comes around. Essentially, as an individual and even as a group, or maybe especially as a group, in the long run, everybody would be better off, and in the short run too, if everyone followed those rules, even if the rules aren't quite right.
Thank you, Mike. Next up is Anna, followed by Kevin. Anna?
Another interesting topic I thought today. What I was thinking about was just like authenticity and transparency. There's a range of it, right? But I feel like you can't be 100% authentic all the time. You have to be more strategic. What I was actually thinking about was small talk. You know, for a very long time, I didn't understand the purpose of small talk. But now I think I realized that the whole purpose of small talk is like you're starting off with a neutral base. And as you're slowly talking to the person and you're understanding how they think, what their values are, you can kind of tell whether or not you should continue having the conversation with them or you should just kind of stop. So I feel like it's a good way to kind of step out of whether or not you should be authentic. Because if the person is not somebody who shares your values or your philosophies in life, you can just not talk to them anymore. I mean, that's the benefits of being in New York City.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Anna. Next up is Kevin.
And life is complex. We are born different. We need to accept the change of ourselves and outside our world. We need to love who we are and where we live, and enjoy the moment we live. Enough could be never enough. Words of meaning could be interpreted different. The motivation is important behind like why lie, why the mask. I think authentic, immoral, and transparent bad way is also not good. My question for John is, do you think we also need to prove our value system about what is good or bad from, let's see, outside the personal level, like from media and from government policy? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. So, John, so we can go in multiple ways. I mean, one of the themes I want to bring up is that most people, when they think of authenticity, they think about authentic with relation to other people. But I think first it is all about being authentic to yourself and kind of being honest with yourself. And that to me is like a black and white case. Like, why would you not be authentic? Why would you not face yourself? Why would not, because I think like much of the inauthenticness starts with yourself. So on that, I think it's a very straightforward case. And there is no circumstance I can think of saying that I should lie to myself. So what do you think of that like, I'm approaching it step by step. I mean, first is just talking about being authentic within yourself or to yourself.
Yeah, so that's the point that I brought up from the quote from Dostoevsky: above all, don't lie to yourself, et cetera, et cetera. You lose respect for yourself, and then you lose the capacity to love. Not only respect for yourself, but then it superimposes around all other relationships in your external environment from proximity. So, as I said in the presentation, your relationship with yourself sets the precedent. Everything else is kind of going to be an extension of that, if you will. And I really want to explore, kind of related to that theme of like deliberately obfuscating something. So being authentic doesn't mean have to be openly expressive about everything, all of your secrets, all of your idiosyncrasies, right? You can be like not secretive, you can be a I guess reserved person, and that you still be authentic to yourself. I think that's the most important thing that matters there, is like your belief, your actions, your values, your words are all in alignment with one another. And in conjunction with this point, I wanted to talk about the point that Praveen actually established. This is a profoundly philosophical proposition. He said, you become who you pretend to be. That is profoundly deep. You become who you pretend to be. So in simple, and the simple analysis, don't practice being somebody who you would not like, right? So it's simple. Don't practice somebody that you could extrapolate into the future. If you feel like you're inauthentic in a friend group, or you feel like you're forcing yourself to do something, why would you practice that? Why would you continue to engage in that behavior? So I think it's a very fruitful line of inquiry.
Excellent. So what other themes? I have noticed some other themes. So firstly, let's talk about this with respect to other people, because that's where I think most of the questions and most of the caveats and reservations came from. So let us take for granted that you're an authentic person within yourself. How do you engage other people? How do you so I can think of going kind of step by step. Think of kind of close relationships that you have, people with common values who are also going up and who care about you, you care about them. I mean, that's a clear case of more authentic both individuals are, more you're going to get from that relationships. I mean, that's a clear case for me. Then at the extreme case, there is a case where the other person is actually trying to hurt you, is trying to actually destroy you. I mean, their nature is such that they are trying to destroy you. And there is no reason to help that at all. And you can be authentic in living by protecting yourself against such a person. So I think it is, so at that extreme, you have that you definitely don't give them any assistance in destroying you or your values. And then there is a whole bunch of things in the middle. So how do you think about interaction, openness with other people, transparency with other people, authenticity in various social situations?
Yeah, so I look at it as a reflection, going off of the first point that I established, and bringing it back a little bit to the analogy of, the pond, the water, right? So, Walden was talking about it, Nietzsche was talking about it, where the more authentic, the more transparent, the more like upfront and honest you are, and you have really nothing to hide. You're not embarrassed about anything. You're more vulnerable. That's all like tethered together, right? It can be kind of convoluted with these terminologies, but that's all tethered together in the sense that you can be completely authentic, you can be completely transparent. People can see like to your bottom, or at least what you're willing to exhibit the bottom of, right? So maybe just that part of your life. They can see to the bottom. Now, does this promote the propensity for exploitation? Possibly. But again, that could just be a necessary cost that you might have to be okay with, accepting as the consequence of being vulnerable. That might be, that might put you in circumstances where you might be exploited or embarrassed or taken advantage of. But if you are, if you have that, you mentioned close relationships. If you have that, level of familiarity with someone, you would at least be able to, make that judgment call of trust and say, okay, they're authentic as well. They're being vulnerable with me in return. So I can say, okay, I have, there's someone giving you power to exploit them, if you will. It makes me think of the Peterson idea. A harmless man is not a good man. That doesn't equate. A good man is somebody who is capable of harm and doesn't harm, right? They keep their sword sheathed. It's like, that's how you can tell the merit and the character and the morality and ethical stance of somebody. A harmless man, it's not, you don't know until they have the opportunity. And if they withhold that, that's how you can tell their ethical thing. So I think that's also spilling over into the authenticity thing. If you're authentic, if you're transparent, you're giving somebody a tool to exploit you. And if they don't do that, okay, cool. That's going to further facilitate that deep relationship with that person.
Yeah. So in regard to relationship with other people, so you have this one extreme of kind of close relationships where it's really good to be authentic. At the other extreme, you have people trying to hurt you, in which case you should not be transparent about yourself, so that would hurt you. And there is a place in the middle where this issue is really critical. And I think Barry just nailed it. It's a question, it's not really the question about people hurting you and dealing with people who are actually out to destroy you and your values. I think people don't have trouble with that. It's where people very clearly see, okay, it's not in my interest at all. The area where this is really kind of comes to the main decision is that, are you going to try to fit in, or are you going to actualize yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is actually trying to hurt you. It's just that, if you're trying to fit in, you're trying to mold yourself so you can do that. And I think that is the issue where this authenticity is really the kind of the question comes up and has profound implications for life. So the question is, what is the choice between self-actualization and fitting in? So what I would like to do is I would just like to open up for questions on just that issue. What do you think, and try to be very brief, everybody, okay? What is your take on this trade-off between self-actualization and fitting in? If you want to try to say anything that you want to say in about 2 to 3 sentences, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to say something. Sarika, you're first.
Okay, well, I think that unprecedented in the entire course of history, we have the internet, which is like a reflection of humanity and all its like microcosms of societies. And so if ever before we have an opportunity to move towards some kind of authentic living, hopefully.
Excellent. Excellent. I mean, it actually allows you to connect to anybody you want to connect. And it kind of removes the limits of how many people you can connect to. And you don't have to connect to people whom you don't need to connect, you don't want to connect to. Wonderful. All right, next up is Lloyd and Dave. Folks, keep everything very short. This is like a lightning round of what is your take on self-actualization versus fitting in. Lloyd.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that you have the internal validation, definitely gives you the freedom to self-actualize more than the fitting in. So that next week's topic is really important to this.
Thank you. Next up is Dave, followed by Kevin. Dave.
Yes, Shrikant. To me, if you fit in, you're stuck in a situation. If you become self-actualized, you may move on to bigger and better things, another group.
Wonderful. Next up is Kevin.
We talk about the self-improvement and self-surpassing. We can self-actualize ourselves now. We can fit in, feel better ourselves tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. George.
I'll be brief. I think that's the existential quagmire.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Mark, followed by Jean. Mark.
I'm just going to reiterate what I think Deborah said earlier, which I agree with. Like, yes, there is a tension there, but I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I think to deny fitting in is probably a hindrance to final self-actualization. You just have to be aware of where it's leading you with that tension.
Wonderful. Next up is Jean, followed by Judith. Jean.
Yeah, I think self-actualization and be transparent with yourself. You not just fit in, you actually should lead. You should set an example to lead others to do the same, inspire others.
That's wonderful.
Be a leader, not fit in.
Excellent. That's beautifully put. So that integrates both kind of your own drive and your interaction with social. Next up is Judith, followed by Maxine. Judith.
Yeah, I think if you just think of anything great that's ever been done, artistic, scientific, anything, it had to have been done by someone who was self-actualized. So that far outweighs anything that negative that self-actualization could give.
Next up is Maxine.
Self-actualization is sometimes very painful. It's much easier to take the other path.
Yes, there's no question about that. It is full of effort. Okay, excellent. So folks, this is wonderful. Let's, John, another great meetup. What's coming up next?
Next week, we are talking about an episode of Black Mirror titled Nosedive. Very thought-provoking. If you can watch it, I would strongly suggest it. It's not mandatory. I will summarize the relevant and necessary points, similar to like we did today with the book. It's not mandatory, but I would suggest it if you have the opportunity. And we're talking about how to rely more on internal validation than external noise.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everybody. Good night. See you soon. Bye.